Thank you. Rushanara.
Good afternoon. Chancellor, I just wanted to focus my questions on the overall tax burden. I know some of it's already been touched on, and also the taper rate. So in your speech, you said that your goal is to reduce taxes, and the OBR has said that the tax burden is forecast to increase to the highest rate since Clement Attlee. Now, Clement Attlee had a lot to show for his tax increases in the form of the National Health Service, which we continue to benefit from, education and the welfare state, and much else. What do you have to show for the tax burden rising to the level that it has? And is it comparable to the ambition of the post-war Clement Attlee government?
Well, I mean, you talked about two things, right? You talked about education, you talked about the NHS. I mean, that accounts for a good chunk of where the money goes on the NHS.
The catch-up jar set out a request for about 15 billion. The amount that you've invested nowhere near is that. So.
Yes, it's £5 billion, and again, you might want to cut the pie differently, Rushanara, right? So that's totally reasonable. What I'd say is the reason the tax burden is very high is because we're spending a lot on lots of different things. So I think no one can disagree that the pie is really large, and you might say, well, I want to spend even more on catch-up, but you've got to point to the bit that you're going to spend less on, which I don't know if
perhaps
you had...
as Siobhan was talking about, the 4.5 billion in the banking sector, the tax rate you gave them. Is that a fair way to allocate resources?
I don't think that comes anywhere close. The tax rate on banks is going up. Right, so actually they're going to be collecting more from banks than we were previously, because the tax rate on them is going from 27 to 28. But what do you get for it? So on catch-up, £5 billion, it's obviously a very significant investment in catch-up. What is it doing? It's doing a few things. The things that I would focus most on are the areas where the evidence points to there being the biggest effect on kids' learning, and that is teachers and tutoring, small group tutoring. Now, all the evidence that we've been through would tell you that if you do small group tutoring, that can have a really beneficial effect on people's ability to learn faster. There is just a delivery constraint on how much tutoring you can do, because you've got to hire people, they've got to be able to deliver it properly, and we have broadly maxed out on that amount of what we can do. And then secondly, on the teaching side, again, there's a delivery constraint on how many teachers can you provide extra CPD for, extra mentoring for, particularly in the early stage of their career, and we're maxing out on those things broadly as well. Those are the best evidence we have. And then separately, there's money going into increasing the number of hours post-16, and then just broadly premiums that are delivered to schools to use slightly in their discretion.
So thank you, Chancellor.
And I'm sorry, on NHS, probably, which is important because you mentioned it, and Attlee, obviously, you're right to highlight that.
But he established the NHS. I mean, you
yes,
and
it
fixed
continues.
the underinvestment that we've seen.
Yeah, he established it, but I don't think when he set it up, he probably envisaged the demographics that were going to be in place 60 years later, nor did he envisage a pandemic, which meant that the backlog for the NHS was reaching unacceptable levels. So where is this money going? This money is going to reduce the backlog to help us catch up with millions and millions of operations, and it's going on coping with the demographic pressures in a wealthier society demanding more from its healthcare system.
So I think what I'm trying to get at is, given we've come out of a pandemic, or coming out of a pandemic, the choices you're making, and some of the longer-term pressures on the economy. We talked earlier this morning about productivity, the hit on productivity from Brexit in the long run of about 4%, and also the pandemic-related costs of about a productivity hit of about 2%. When you add up these things, including the tax burden that's increased quite dramatically, should the British people be confident that the measures you've put in place in terms of taxation and expenditure, and given what's happened, both in relation to Brexit consequences as well as pandemic, that we are set in the long run to make up for the losses in the economy and productivity on your watch in terms of the plans you've put in place?
So I think, look, already people can see that the plan we put in place is working. A year ago, people were saying unemployment was going to be 12%. Now the forecast is for it to be around 5% at peak. That's 2 million fewer people out of work than previously forecast. As the OBR said, they described our interventions as remarkably successful in their words. I did see some comment from this morning that they were positively surprised by how successful of our interventions had been. So I think people can take some confidence from the fact that what we've done over the last 12 to 18 months has averted what could have been a very significant outcome in the labour market, and indeed on scarring. A year ago, and even more recently, the OBR believed that scarring, as did others, would be 3%. That has now been revised down, and you've talked about what's the long-term damage of these things. Are our policies making a difference? Well, clearly they are, right? Because it's been reduced from 3% to 2%, and that is driven by a lot of different factors. There's three main components that go into scarring, right? There's capital shallowing, there's total factor productivity in the labour market. Particularly on the labour market, outcomes have been far better than anyone expected, so that's meant that people could reduce that. And on the capital side, because of things like the super deduction or the fact that we've lowered business insolvencies and investment in things like R&D and innovation has continued to be strong, people can feel much more confident that there is not going to be as big a hit to total factor productivity component of the scarring. So I think actually that's pretty good, right? And there's still room to go, right? Who's to say we can't reduce it further?
So what would you say to the IMF's global forecast that suggests that UK's recovery will lag behind other G7 nations? And also, you mentioned the OBR. Obviously, their projections are that the growth is going to go down. What is your, how do we keep up with other countries?
So actually, the IMF has us growing second fastest, I think, this year, and they're of all the numbers, they're probably the ones that have been least recently revised. So let's see what they say later this year when they do those. The OECD projections, which are more recently updated, have us growing faster than everyone else. And now, whether you look at nominal or real GDP, the catch-up that we have is squarely in line with other major economies that we compete with, so there's no major delta there at all. And whether now that is true, whether you look on nominal or real basis, actually, which is good as some of those measurement issues unwind. But what gives me confidence is, A, the plan we put in place over the last year and a half has worked. That has led to upgrades to what people thought, so I think you take some confidence in the fact that we've done a good job in limiting the damage of the last year and a half. And then going forward, I have confidence in our plan for growth. Right? I think investing in infrastructure, investing in skills, investing in innovation, those are the things that I believe will drive up growth.
So I've got two other questions. One is, are you raising taxes now so that you can cut taxes closer to a general election?
Believe me, the last thing I would do is voluntarily raise taxes. So we've had to do that to fund. We're doing that. We've done that to fund what we needed to do. Right? It's to fix the damage that coronavirus has done. It's to make sure the NHS can get the resources it needs to recover from a pandemic where the backlog was going to stretch to unacceptable levels, and to fund, what are landmark reforms of the social care system, which other governments have not done. So that's why those things were done. It's a once in a 300-year economic shock. It's unsurprising that it's had some consequences.
So in terms of what you've done with this budget, women are left with £48 billion. They're poorer by your budget, according to the House of Commons Library. And 6 million families have been hit by the £20 cut from universal credit. And even though, yes, 1.9 million families will benefit from the change of this taper rate, we're going to see over 4 million children who are going to still live in poverty. And so the inequities, your government talks a lot about levelling up. The inequities have got sharper, and the gender differences are even greater. What are you going to do to try and address the hit on living standards? The director, you mentioned the IFS. The director of the IFS described living standards actually being awful in the next few years. How should our constituents, how can our constituents cope with all that's happened and the hit that's going to be on them, on these demographic groups that I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely right to focus on women and children. I'd say a few things. So I think that's very important, and it was in my thinking as we constructed the budget and the spending review. You talked about single parents. I think a mother's a single parent who's working full time on the national living wage with 2 kids, renting. As a result of the change to the universal credit taper rate, is going to be £1,200 better off. So I think that's significant support. We know you talked about children growing up in poverty. Actually, there are fewer children in poverty today than there were in 2010. And we know that children in workless households are 5 times more likely to be in poverty than those without. And actually now there are several 100,000 fewer children in poverty because of that situation, which is why supporting work and making work pay is important to making sure children don't grow up like that. But I think the other thing I'd say is we did a lot to support young families. And your parents with children in the early years of their life, as a result of the spending review, there's more funding going into supporting them. There's been a lot of work done about exactly where we can be helpful. So whether it's the investment in the early years workforce, £150 million to help them with professional development, whether it's the £170 million extra a year for provider rates, whether it's £200 million for the Supporting Families programme, or indeed £300 million for the set of interventions across early intervention, family hubs, parenting programmes, or the digitised Red Book. I think that is considerable support, particularly disproportionately will benefit women, that will help children. It will mean that they don't grow up in poverty.
Look, there's no question that you've been presiding over as Chancellor under incredibly challenging circumstances, and the CJRS scheme and others were very, very much what the country needed. But, earlier you were talking about speed of delivery, but the waste is something the British people should have not, the waste of public money, billions of pounds, should not have to have put up with. And now what we're seeing is that money that could have been used for, towards the levelling up agenda, for instance, and those that haven't, the numbers I've mentioned to you, the groups that are suffering and will continue to suffer because of inflation, cost of goods, fuel prices and the rest of it. So that ineffective use of public money is a serious matter, as the NAO pointed out, as Dame Angela's mentioned as well. And it's important that, frankly, a Labour government, if it presided over that kind of waste, a Labour Chancellor would have probably been hung, drawn and quartered. So the question is, what are we going to do about the millions of people who are not going to benefit from the taper? I welcome what you've done with the 1.9 or so million who are going to benefit, but there are millions of others. The universal credit cut is not going to help. And while at the same time these other pressures are kicking in, with fuel prices and food prices going up, what will you do about them? Because the measures you've put in place are not going to reach them. And we are seeing, in constituencies like mine, child poverty has gone up to 60%. And it's hitting people very hard up and down the country. Chancellor, what are you going to do about those people?
So, you were just talking about fuel prices a lot, Rushanara. We've talked about freezing fuel duty, which I think Angela disagrees with.
I'm just
so
giving
freezing
you an example
fuel duty will actually help
all
those people.
And
you guys might disagree, but I think that is something that will help. The universal credit taper rate, as we've said, will considerably help all those people. And the national living wage increase will considerably help all those people. And then, of course, the household support fund that we put in place before, we did it early to give people reassurance, is £500 million geared towards 2 to 3 most vulnerable families in the country, many of the people that you'll be talking about that will benefit from that. And that comes on top of many of the things we've already done. Just pick one example. One thing we did last year, which we've maintained, is an uplift in the local housing allowance, and we increased it by a considerable amount, £1 billion a year extra, which means 1.5 of the most vulnerable families are receiving over £600 a year more to help with things like rent payments. So, and those are all the reasons that actually, if you look at any of the distribution analyses, at any of the fiscal events that we've done since I've been Chancellor, what they show is a very progressive set of measures, which is disproportionately benefiting those on the lowest incomes in the lowest income deciles. I mean, those are all the things that have been published. They're all there for you to see, and that's the story that they tell, because our support has been geared towards those who need our help the most.
That's not true.